morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is for me an honor and a pleasure to have been invited to be with you this morning, for which I very much thank my good friend, Ilkka Laitinen, the Executive Director of Frontex. Time is a very precious commodity, so we're going to try to make best use of it this morning. The focus of our discussion, as you have just seen on the screen, is border control in times of crisis through the eyes of practitioners. And to help me and to help us explore this topic this morning, we have four very distinguished panelists. First of all, Ilkka Laitinen, Executive Director of Frontex, Angela Priya, do you say Angela or Angela? Angela Priya, who's the Director General from the Italian Ministry of the Interior, Department of Immigration, Operational Coordination and Civil Liberties. To my right, Iona Cozzioni, who's the Migration Referent with Médecins Sans Frontières. She's based in Athens. And to my extreme right, Henry Bolton, who's a strategic expert, Integrated Border Management, Civilian Planning and Conduct Capability Directorate, European External Action Service. And I think his job is at least as complicated as his title. Ladies and gentlemen, emergencies. By nature, they are complex, they are difficult to handle. But let me just break the ice as an opener, put a simple question to our panelists. Where will the next emergency come from? Could I ask you, Ilkka, to begin with?
Thank you very much, Gervaise, and I think after the lecture that we got from Alexander Betts, I think nobody in this room dare to say it. But what I think it's the most important thing to acknowledge is that we are living among perhaps the highest level of uncertainty. And there are many known uncertainties, and there are a growing number of unknown uncertainties. And that makes the task to answer your question even more complicated. But just if we think about the such commonly known geopolitical factors currently around Europe and in the world, we can see many of those, and it depends on the triggers which might lead to some scenarios to become true. So unfortunately, I cannot answer your question directly when and what would be the next crisis that we all are involved. That's very demanding, not only to the border guards, but also to others to follow the indicators, drafting, developing scenarios, and plan and improve the readiness to be ready to tackle whenever and what type of event might come up.
Thank you very much. So we retain from that the important thing is preparedness. Angela, would you like to comment, please?
Italy, as shown by images, is the first border of the European Union, southern border of the European Union, especially arrivals from North Africa. Experience from the year 2011, where over 60,000 people arrived in Italy, well, makes some projects projects which we already have in order to tackle migrants arriving to Italy, especially project Presidium, a project made by many agencies, l'UNHCR, UN, Red Cross, Italian Red Cross. All these organizations run this project in order to enhance the existing system so that people arriving from the North Africa, we have to realize are people who have traumatic experience of traveling to Italy. Their relationship with police, with Carabinieri, with Guardia di Finanza, these relations are difficult, and they need to have a partner among organizations such as Red Cross, so that this organization can supply them with a number of pieces of information on opportunities they can find, possibilities they can find in a country. These things need to be, of course, observed by those who arrive to the territory of Italy, because who arrives are people who ask for asylum, but also economic migrants. So these requires two different ways of keeping them within the Italian territory, as required by the European Union. So the project I'm talking about started in the year 2005 from a project financed by the European Union. Today we offer a series of information because, well, in spite of human rights, we need to remember about those who require asylum.
Thank you very much. The importance of maintaining that balance, the equation between humanitarian needs and, of course, the imperative of border management and control. Joanna, Henry, would you like to comment briefly on that? How to predict an emergency? Is it possible at all to predict emergencies, and where might the pressure points be?
Thank you for the question. I think that Médecins Sans Frontières, being an international organization, and working actually predominantly in crisis situations, is quite well positioned in a way not to foresee necessarily crisis, but to have a good understanding. Because foremost we work in origin countries, so we do witness the reasons that force people to flee. Then we work in several transit countries, so then we also have the possibility to witness what people are going through and how they can manage to continue their trip or not. And we have also experience in host destination countries, predominantly Southern European countries. Therefore, I would say that today we are already in a crisis. This is very well known, the most well-known currently, producing massive refugee flows is the Syrian crisis. So I think for us, it's primary concern to ensure that people are able to flee, that there is a safe humanitarian passage for people that need to flee Syria. Then that since the majority are actually seeking refuge in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and already we can, with more than 1.5 million registered refugees and several unregistered, the capacity is overstretched in all these countries. And then a concern is whether there is sufficient preparedness, contingency planning in countries that could, in Europe, that could receive a larger influx, like Cyprus and Greece. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Henry, your views?
Yeah, I don't like the word crisis for a start, and I think Alexander made the point well that immigration, migration is nothing new. What we're talking about here is areas of increased risk. And if we look around the world and we look at causes of, or the sources of those sort of risks, and I think we're looking at instability in a number of areas: political instability, military instability, rule of law instability, human security risks, economic, environmental risks. There are a lot of drivers, and again, Alexander went over many of them. And I think we can look around and we can see the areas in the world where there are such cases of instability, if you like, and that may well be drivers for changes in migration flows or rates. And I think, to give you an example, in both 2007 and 2008, I addressed a number of naval planners from NATO on the risk from North Africa, which nobody had predicted the Arab Spring. However, it was clear that there were things happening, there were currents existing across North Africa, the Sahel, the Maghreb, that later we saw the results. But already at that point, it was indeed possible to identify an area of risk. What it wasn't possible to do was to be specific about the character and nature of that risk. And it leaves the question of what do you do about it if you do indeed identify it. And if I may just say one thing, we're talking about migration, but there are also other risks that affect us on borders, security-related risks. And it would be nice to sort of broaden this into that area as well, this discussion.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, let's do just that. What we have established through that very brief exchange is two things. First of all, the art of prediction is an extremely difficult one. However, the potential is there. The challenge is determining our levels of preparedness and getting ready for whatever might happen. So I'd like to have a second round of interventions, and this time I'll ask the panelists a slightly different question. When the emergency does arise, what are the challenges for policymakers and program managers? And I would like this issue to be addressed from the four different perspectives. A Frontex perspective, a perspective from the Ministry of Interior and from someone who has to handle reception. What happens after the arrival? A civil society, Médecins Sans Frontières perspective, and a perspective from the coordination of national and cross-European, pan-European efforts. So Ilke, can I turn to you again? What are the essential challenges that you see in front of Frontex when an emergency arises?
Well, I think we should not too much focus on Frontex, but talk about the work of border guards in that respect. And the border guards are very often the first authorities that come across with migrants, being in different situations. What is important, and what is the key word, no matter what the situation is, my keyword is control, so that whenever people come, the control is there to address proper consecutive processes. This sounds a little bit technocratic, but there is a reason behind that. What dominates these measures, of course, is the basic values, and the most important things is to save human lives. That is the dominant of all these things. But the control is the key word. And I think, once again, I make the reference to the lecture of Alexander about the complexity of the situation, and I'm repeating that the consecutive and interlinked processes, because border control is only one part of the process, very important, that supports the others and is interdependent of other processes. So in order to be prepared to maintain and develop control, we need awareness. This is one of the very important things. We need awareness on the local level, we need awareness on the regional level, European level, and even global level. And that's quite a task to collect all the information, process it adequately, and draw right conclusions. If not conclusions can be drawn, then develop and further elaborate with scenarios. So it's very important to keep the control and then support the other things. But once again, the most important things, that we saw the movie and the pictures, is to save human lives. That is the most important thing. And then, once again, keyword is control.
Thank you very much. Angela, if therefore you look at a similar situation from your perspective, what are the key policy challenges that you see?
Yes. The challenge which we perceive is, as recorded before, is that migration is already a structural fact on the European level and also on the global level. This has to be taken into account by everybody. I took part in the Bali process regarding Pacific issues. Pacific is bigger than Mediterranean, but has similar issues than Mediterranean. USA have got the same problem with Bahama Islands. So motives are different, as said before, wars, climate, other economic issues mainly. So in Italy, we imagine, after the experience of the year 2012, we imagine a consolidated reception system in the ordinary way. On December 31st, the policy for emergency states expired, so we needed to equip ourselves to be prepared for these arrivals. We expect that they will be bigger than last year, not necessarily on the levels of 2011, but as it was said before, we do not have a glass ball to predict. The unstable situation in the Africa will definitely keep these levels of migration. So Italy tries now and engage the overall national territory, because we cannot imagine a situation in which we keep all these people in certain centers only, but to be aware that these people who will stay in Italy, if they have right, will stay in Italy, so we need to adopt a number of schemes. I will talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Challenge of addressing the needs of those who stay and making sure that they have access to certain services. But let me turn to Joanna. From a civil society perspective, Joanna, how do you see the policy challenges, and what are the particular points that you would like to emphasize?
Well, what I would say is, a bit contradicts a bit some of the things we've heard already, is the issue of that we don't know when a crisis will happen, and therefore we might not be prepared, etc. And this is partly true, but what we've already witnessed several times is that even when a crisis is ongoing, what is the biggest problem is usually the lack of political willingness to do something about it. So this is one point. Luckily, last year, actually 2 years ago, in the Libya crisis, it was one of the few times that actually financial assistance was provided quickly, fast enough, and it was managed in a good way. Very often we see that the response from on the part of the authorities is quite slow. Another thing is that more and more we see that crises are protracted. And what we are lacking in the civil society, in the international organizations, member states, countries, is contingency plans for addressing these protracted crises. Also, things have changed. We don't. We see that less and less the traditional concept of a displacement that is then followed by a refugee camp, a refugee settlement, does not apply. We see that people are moving in different directions, people are moving in urban settings, so we need to diversify the tools and our response. And specifically from our experience in working in border areas, and this is from Malta, from Italy, and from Greece, during times of crisis, while we were able, and this is our job, to provide quickly with emergency relief and medical assistance, what then is a question is how the vulnerable groups will be identified and managed, and I think this is a big gap, and there is a lot of room for improvement in the identification and management of vulnerable persons, and then, of course, the whole protection system that needs to also be adapted to answer effectively in the challenges of this new survival migration, as it was mentioned, mixed flows, people that are fleeing but are not necessarily fall under the category traditionally of the Convention of Geneva.
Jana, I'd like to come back to you shortly on that question of survival, migrants, between inverted commas, and vulnerable groups. But Henry, your view about, again, key messages. You know, what would you see as being the important issues to focus upon when you have to coordinate and improve levels of cooperation across different countries?
The first thing is a common vision of what you're trying to achieve. And in my experience, the best way of getting countries or even agencies to work together is being able to identify, first of all, the common interests that they have. Now, those might be economic, as I said earlier, or they might be threat-related. But that's the sort of common thread that will connect countries, and it may be dealing with migration flows. The second thing, then, is a framework for cooperation. And again, whether that's at the international level, the national level, or local within nations, or within particular sort of border posts even, there needs to be a framework for cooperation. And that in turn requires an identification of all the stakeholders. So the stakeholders have to be mapped out, and there needs to be a sort of a strategy at each one of those levels to engage with and cooperate within the national policy framework. And I think in that respect, it's it's very important to, I mentioned earlier, sort of in a sense to broaden the discussion a little bit. We know that migration is affected by many different drivers. And in turn it can affect things. And if we look at the nexus between instability, corruption, organized crime, the economy, etc., we find that there are actually a plethora of organizations, local NGOs, national, international NGOs, international organizations, some of which actually have a leading role in this area, in setting global policy and best practice as institutions of repositories of knowledge and best practice, and in some cases legislation. And I think we need to map all these out at the relevant levels, including a very low local level, and we need to then set a strategy for that cooperation. Now that's a lot of work, but back to Ilka's point about awareness. We need to be aware of those other actors and what they can bring to the table. We're all part of a team in that respect. We're not just border guards or customs officers or whatever we might be. We are part of a team, and we need to bring that team together.
Well, let me now probe a little bit into the answers you have, the very interesting answers you have provided, and unsettle you a little bit with some more difficult questions. Henry, do you feel that the European community, and I'm talking of community in the broad sense, is at the right level of preparedness and awareness at the moment? Or do you feel instead that there are gaps?
I don't think anybody in this room would say we're in a perfect situation and there's no room for improvement. Of course there is. And as we speak, in fact, there is a debate that's just been initiated in Brussels to try and actually define more effectively or review our vision of what we think integrated border management is. Now, I can't predict what the outcome of that will be, but there is an effort to review and improve our performance in this area. Of course, we have to put in place various processes and systems which, whilst tools to help us meet certain challenges, are also in themselves going to channel us and condition us to think and act in a particular way. Therefore, they're constraints. They also constrain our freedom of action. To move outside those systems and accepted norms is often quite difficult. So there are some challenges for all of us at every level and everybody in this room in that respect. I think we also have to recognise that I talked about a common thread linking different agencies and countries in this respect. And even as member states within the European Union, we are in different situations. Those members of the European Union on the southern flank of Europe, if you like, most immediately affected by the situation in North Africa and Central Africa and West Africa from that moment, they have a particular focus on those issues that might be a little bit stronger than others. So there is always this little bit of tension. So long as we have the awareness that we're part of that whole team, that we don't, as European member states, don't act only in the national interest, but act in terms of strengthening the team and the team effort, then we will make progress, I think, a lot more rapidly.
Sure. Quick question. If I were to ask you, we're talking about cross-country cooperation. What about cooperation at the national level? Is there room for improvement among the different agencies that are involved in emergencies? State emergency services, the Ministry of Interior, the border guards themselves, police, various emergency, civil society agencies involved in emergencies. Is there a room for further improvement in the coordination at the national level before cooperation across states is dealt with?
I think national and international can be concurrent in addressing them. We don't have to wait for one before we go to the other, and they should always be constantly evolving. We should be constantly reviewing them in the light of new circumstances, evolving circumstances. But there is a great deal of room for improvement. We all have to get outside our comfort zones. We all have to get outside our dogmatic ways of thinking, and we have to, as institutions, allow our personnel and our staff to be able to come up with solutions and to challenge, in a constructive way, of course, present methodologies. I think in terms of the specific cooperation and coordination at the national level, some governments have been very proactive in trying to find and develop frameworks within which everything that I've said can be placed and to help facilitate that cooperation. Other countries have been, should we say, slightly handicapped in doing so because of the stovepiped and independent or autonomous or freedom of movement and authority that their different ministries and agencies have. It's to do with power, ego, budgetary control, all sorts of things. And as I say, we all have to challenge that a little bit. We all have to, if we want to secure European borders, and if we want to move upstream outside Europe to deal with the threats that might come at us, then we have to be better at overcoming these sort of challenges.
Thank you very much. Joanna, let me come back to you and come back to your reference to vulnerable groups. You implied that contemporary emergencies are far more complex. They're evolving. And they throw up categories of need that may not have been evident in the past. Can I ask you to elaborate on that further? In the past, the distinction, the major distinction on which we focused was, of course, those who had a genuine need for protection under the terms of the 1951 Convention, and those who essentially had economic motivations. And we sort of felt that these two groups could be divided up fairly easily. But you seem to imply that the current situation is a bit more complicated. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. An example of how things are more complicated would be, for example, the flow of Ethiopian migrants out of Ethiopia today. Most of them cross through Yemen. So you would normally consider that as opposed to Somalis, who are considered also prima facie refugees when they arrive in Yemen, that Ethiopian migrants are economic migrants. But then when you actually see where these people are coming from, when you see that government policies and practices in Ethiopia have indirectly forced them to flee, and to give you just a small example, taxation policy has meant that several people who survival was through subsistence agriculture have lost their farms, and they've had to actually find a way to survive, thus fleeing Ethiopia. And then you have these people who are already vulnerable due to the circumstances that led them to flee, and then they are very often subjected to the risk of violence and abuse by smuggling groups, trafficking groups, and just common criminal gangs. And we see more and more, we witness more and more these violence taking to the extreme levels. So recently, to give you an example, almost 1,500 Ethiopians were released from some smuggling farms in Yemen, and several of them had suffered extreme violence to the degree of being shot in their limbs or having their tongues cut off, because actually these people, the kidnappers, they wanted to get ransom, which would amount to maybe $100. So people are suffering extreme violence, and an interesting in relation to what was said before regarding the new technology and the mobile use, is that actually this proliferation of these tactics of kidnapping people who are completely vulnerable along the way is made much more easy because of the mobile phones, because people have a mobile phone on them, so then the kidnappers can easily call their families or friends and ask for ransom. So indeed, we're talking about very complex vulnerabilities. What we need to be, and this audience, the border guards, need to be well aware of, is that the majority of the people they encounter at the European borders have actually suffered to one or another degree violence and other forms of abuse. And I think we need really to enhance capacity and understanding of this situation.
Thank you very much. And let me now turn to Ilke. Would you like to intervene on that?
In fact, I would like to accompany what Henry said and also comment what Joanna said about the thing. And you asked the question whether the European Union worked properly during the Libyan crisis, and what can be done better. I think it's partly a right question. We were deeply involved in the Libyan crisis, and from Frontex point of view, I think that the monitoring and the exchange of information at the European Union level, it went properly well. It was a systematic, good exchange of information at all levels, all institutions, all agencies involved. But I think that the key question is whether the European Union member states consider the European Union to be the primary actor. and that aligns with the level of commitment. On the other hand, the European Union was and is expected to deliver. And we came across with the same thing, because at the European Union level, also at the time of the Libyan crisis, Frontex was, if not the only, among the few practitioners, the European practitioners, that participated at the operational level to the management of these things, which on the other hand raises the expectations to the agency. It also raised some unfounded perceptions. What is the role of the agency? What is the role of border guards? And so on. And this does not align with the view, what has been said many times, that the management of borders, border management, no matter if at the time of crisis or not, it's a very, very complex thing. There are many processes that are interlinked, that are consecutive in this entity, and the border guards, they take care of one particular part of that, where the control is the key word, and very important part is identification. It's about not only the safety, but also the security side, understood in many ways. What Jonna said about the situation and the new profiles of vulnerable people, it's one example of that. And it's a challenging job, because as a rule, people do come to the borders of the European Union member states undocumented. So it's quite a challenging task to identify these people in order to protect the vulnerable people, and at the same time take care of the security interests that we are coming across.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. But let me come back to you on that and the question of identity, which I find absolutely fascinating. One would have thought that in 2013, with all the technological advances that have taken place in recent years, the international community would be in a much better position to identify, to verify identity. You seem to be implying that this is not the case, that it's just as complicated, or perhaps even complicated, more complicated. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, current challenges?
Well, the challenge is to establish in a reliable manner the identity of the person who don't have the documentation. Of course, we might have some concerns about if they have a document, whether it's genuine or whether it belongs to the right person. And there are many reasons why people come undocumented. Just to give one example about the differences, we are talking about, or we were talking about the same flow of mixed flow of migrants at the European Union and in Turkey. And I paid a visit last week to Turkey, and we make a comparison to the very, let's say, strategic figures about the nationalities. And we are talking about the same mixed flows, but the ranking of the nationalities were slightly different. And that is, even at that level, to establish the nationality of migrants, it's a challenging thing. And therefore, the very important part of the work that belongs to border guards, it's called screening, when we try by all means to establish the identity of these people. That's the prerequisite for the subsequent processes, whether it would be an asylum or whatever it can be, or to safeguard the security interests. And that's challenging. That's so challenging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Angela, let me to round off this particular section, because I'd like to keep some time in reserve for questions from the floor. Let's go back to Italy's situation. And there I want to draw on your experience as a practitioner. When there are very large numbers of people who arrive in an irregular situation, and the numbers are high, there's pressure on the country, on the host country, And I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit more about how that is handled when they arrive. Challenges of reception, challenges of the provision of access to services. Do you keep them in detention centers, or is it better to release them into the community? Could you share with us briefly your experiences there?
Yes. Because it was said that the first rule is to identify. This is absolutely fundamental, because we need to have people who are regular within our territory. We have got in Italy a series of centers that are defined for people who are hosted there. Lampedusa is the center for first aid and reception. It is where the identification and photo signaling take place. This helps us with asylum procedures. So this helps us to define a category where we are going to receive these people. So we have Presidium project at Lampedusa, and this gives us first indication as where to send the migrant. Then reception centers for those who ask for asylum seekers. So people who formally apply for asylum, for those people we need to start formal procedure. I'd like to remind you that Italy is the first EU member state that have commissions that decide about the status of the migrant, so that we can secure proper treatment of these people, guarantee observance of rights. So after we define the position of the migrant, we have got a national system covering Italian territory. This is for refugees and for asylum seekers, where we organize civil education courses, language courses, and professional training, so that they can find their placement in the labor market later on. Such centers can host some 5,000 of these people. The following system, we have got room for 3,000 people. So during that emergency period, we have raised that number. The challenge for this year, in spite we haven't got resources, we want to have 7,000 places, so that we do not intervene in crisis situation, and then we absorb these people and we do not have place where to place them. As said before, a big challenge for the European Union, for each country, in fact, is to counteract trafficking dealt with by international organizations that are behind arrivals on Italian beaches. We have got some 30 agreements with police of our countries, and other agreements which have been very useful to the Frontex itself. The European Union has also recognized its validity in the period of the Libyan crisis. Apart from Frontex in emergency, we have also cooperated very strongly, and we will sign also a new with EASO, European Asylum Organization. We're going to sign an agreement with them in July.
Now, I'd like to give each of the panelists an opportunity to sum up briefly, but before we do that, I think I'm going to go to the floor. We have just a little bit of time for some questions, which I would ask you to put directly to the panel. I would only request that you keep your questions as brief as possible. There's no need to provide a lot of background information. I think it would be extremely useful if you could just offer either a brief question or a brief comment. Is there anyone who'd like to take the floor? If there's no one, oh yes. It's always a little bit difficult to get that first question out, but please, you have the floor, ma'am.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you for this.
Would you mind introducing yourself very briefly?
I'm Petra Hoek from the International Catholic Migration Commission. And I had a question to Angela Pia, and maybe also to MSF, and it's concerned the rising number of unaccompanied minors reaching Europe, particularly Afghan children. And talking about identification of needs and of protection for unaccompanied minors, I would like to ask you what have been your experiences both with Save the Children, identification, and maybe also other recent practices.
Thank you very much. Angela, would you like to respond directly?
La questione dei minori.
The question of minors is a question that well, has been dealt with in Italy in the following way. These minors, they are subject to this procedure helped by Save the Children, which is also a party to the Presidium project. I would like to remind you that there is a big internal debate within the European Union as how to identify the minors so that they are not subject to invasive examination, but that they are privileged and that they are interviewed with the aid of a psychologist. So this is to a bigger extent all the time shared by all member states, so that we recognize these people in such a way. So when we recognize a minor, we have got in Italy centers which are dedicated to the minors on the regional level. They belong to regional authorities. They are responsible for them. So there are facilities equipped for reception of minors. We're talking about foreign minors which are not accompanied, that seek asylum. But we have also facilities for children who are not, or minors who are not asylum seekers. And these facilities work in the same way. Children go to school, they undergo training. I must say that many escape from such facilities, and in many cases they are found in other member states, but then we're using Dublin procedures to bring them back to Italy if they are discovered abroad. So we want to intensify their direction towards professional training so that they can integrate in activities, in the future activities in our countries. Many minors coming from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, they have no interest in staying in Italy because not because we do not guarantee them something, but because they have relatives in the north of Europe. Today we have got bilateral relations with Sweden and with Germany, with France and Switzerland in order to resolve these issues.
Joanna, a brief comment?
I will try to complement the answer regarding the situation in Greece currently, where we actually have had an intervention in the north of Greece in immigration detention facilities between January and April this year, 2013. Unfortunately, the issue of identification of minors remains extremely problematic. We have registered more than 80 young persons who told us that they were minors and they looked very young indeed. In some cases, they mentioned that they had given their age to the officer that registered their data, but then they noticed that the data was registered wrongly. Of course, training, lack of interpretation is definitely a problem when during the registration process. And then, unfortunately, the processes for age assessment are not in place with the protocol. So you would have different practices exercised in different areas. Also, the medical personnel involved is usually personnel from small local or regional hospitals or health centers who lack training to do properly an age assessment. And as a result, we've seen indeed a very big number of minors, mostly Afghans, but also some Somali. And these young boys, it was only boys, they had stayed in detention together with adults, as they were wrongly registered as adults, for 6, 7, 8 months. So it is a very alarming situation currently, and we have raised our concerns with the Greek authorities and the European authorities on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Sure. Very briefly.
Ecco, volevo anche aggiungere che per quanto riguarda...
I wanted to add that as regards Italy, the minors are not to be expelled, so they cannot be sent back to their country of origin. I'd like to emphasize that. So the minors cannot be kept in detention centers. They are sent to so-called reception centers when they are identified as minors.
Opportunity perhaps for another question or two. We are running out of time, but if anyone wishes to respond or react, here's your chance. No? Well, let me turn back to our panelists. Let's wrap up as quickly as we can, and I'll start with Ilke again. Really, there's time for you to add anything to what you've said before, but in particular, I'd like each of you to address one question. With the situation being what it is, the potential for emergencies being very real, if you had to say that there was one particular need in terms of capacity building, what would be it? What would you emphasize for border guards everywhere? What are the strengths, the organizational capabilities that must be built up?
Well, that's a tricky thing, and I have to make choices either to offer you more than one or then cluster it's in a
sure,
big group.
Indeed, please do.
But what I think in terms of crisis or not, what is extremely important to do our utmost to strengthen the trust for border guards and law enforcement more in general. That is very important for many reasons, and I'm now turning back to the different processes, but also from the migrants' point of view. Many things would be much smoother if the perception of border guards would be more positive for those people with whom we come across. Then the other point that I just would like to mention is that to think about the situation if we follow some demands that we should take out the control from the borders. And I think this debate gave quite a good picture what the situation might be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Messages are very clear there. Angela, where would you see the greatest areas of need in terms of building capacities, abilities to respond?
Yes, I think that on the level of the European Union, there should be a bigger awareness in Italy and elsewhere where there is need of resources, economic resources as well, in the moment of crisis. The capacity is to develop bigger contacts, something that we have got in Italy, but we need it also outside of Italy in order to perceive border guards properly. A synergy between police, border guards, and new actors, organizations that manage to be perceived as closer to the migrant who arrives. So organization which is not approached with fear. So these contacts, these synergies should increase more and more all the time, and we should also develop actions that will take place in our countries of origins, in the countries of transit, where we create certain conditions which can absorb flows towards EU member states. Political instability, wars make it all more and more difficult.
Thank you very much. Anna, the floor is yours.
I think this should work. Thank you. I would like to cluster my response in two segments. So I think something that could be easily done is to improve preparedness at the European Union level, to consider pre-positioning, for example, of relief items in certain parts of the southern borders that are very likely to face increased influxes. I think if the civil protection preparedness model was followed, this could definitely improve things in terms of rapid response. And to give an idea, there is an emergency funding under one of the European Union migration funds, but even this emergency funding, the whole process takes a few months. So then you cannot really respond to an emergency when it will take you several months to process this emergency funding. So I think there is a lot of room for improvement in this kind of preparedness and planning. And then a second thing, which I could not stress enough, is that whoever first encounters migrants, and this is usually border officials, police, has a space, a very limited space, but a crucial space indeed to establish this trust. And I think capacity building should really target this component. It's very important. We're often the second people that migrants see after they arrive, and we do see that they rarely have any information and understanding of what is happening. They're often afraid. So I think there is a lot of room for improvement in that first contact. And this would also greatly improve any process of identification of vulnerable cases.
Thank you very much. And Henry, you have the final word.
Thank you. I think, and I hope everybody will agree here, that we have some tremendously good people working in not just the border guard, but the border agencies of all the member states. They believe in what they're doing, they're well trained, they're well equipped, they have the right processes in place and so on. So I wouldn't necessarily say, apart from absolutely agreeing with the trust issue, that's where the capacity building necessarily needs to be placed. It needs to be placed in what the military might call a force multiplier, the enhanced cooperation, the better exchange of information. And for that to happen, and this is my message, that there are decision makers who need to develop a strategic vision and awareness. Awareness is important at all levels, but an awareness of all of the actors, all of the strengths and resources that they can bring to the table in expertise, in best practice, in knowledge. And if I can, you did tell us that we could add something that if we wanted to. And here I think, you know, in the context of the European Union, I've been involved in planning for Libya, and Frontex has contributed to that planning. But I believe that Frontex potentially should be thought of as the repository of knowledge, best practice within the European Union family, and could, as things evolve, take a leading role in providing other elements of the European Union with expertise and knowledge. For example, I've been brought in from the outside for Libya. Wouldn't it be nice if the European Union had and utilised its own resources to do that? So I think, you know, there is a role for Frontex there. There are resource and budgetary issues to be thought about, but I think that's something that should be considered as we go forward as well, to aid all of the above issues.
Thank you very much. I will not try to sum up our exchanges. You will have realized that what we tried to do was not to tell you all you needed to know about emergencies and how to respond to them. That was not the intention. What we wanted to do instead is expose you to some different facets of that reality as you looked at emergencies through the prism of the experiences of our panelists. You will have noticed, however, I'm sure, a parallel between Alexander Betts's presentation and our discussion. First, migration, human mobility is a very present and insistent reality that is not going to change in the future. And no, it is not possible to make some very clear predictions. The potential is there, however. And what can and does happen is extremely complicated. It's a human reality, but that human reality has to be addressed. And I'd like to go back to what Ilka told us from the start. You know, the word control, I've lived my whole life, I suppose, through migration control, dealing with migration control. That word is shied away from very often these days. People are afraid of it. I don't think we should. Control used in the right way, the positive way, is the achievement of the balance between the humanitarian needs and the need to manage the border and mobility effectively. That's what your community is striving to do. And we, of course, hope that these exchanges will have provoked you to thought. That's really what we wanted to do, and help you begin to think about ways in which you might prepare yourself to respond more effectively to the emergencies of the future. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for all their work and their participation, and thank you very much for your attention.